Hey there. Let's talk about communicating business performance. No matter what job you have, no matter what role you are playing, there will come a time when you have to explain to someone how something that you're working on is doing, whether it be a department you manage, a project that you lead. Somebody is going to want to know, is what I'm investing in this effort paying off? And if so, how? And if not, why not? Communicating business performance is at the core of what any business leader needs to master. But it involves a whole lot more than simply throwing a bunch of numbers in front of people and hoping that they figure out what the numbers add up to. It's up to us as business leaders to tell the story and let the numbers support the narrative that we develop. Sometimes we learn this the hard way. I have to admit that when I first ran a business, and this has been 20 some years ago, maybe longer, I didn't really understand this. I think I remember going into my first review session, if you will, loaded with facts and figures. I had more bar charts than you would ever need, more graphs, more tables, but I hadn't thought about what the numbers actually meant and what story the numbers needed to support. And so when the executives started asking me questions, I just would feed them responses based on the numbers, that this number was this and this number was that. And I hadn't really thought through what my numbers were all about. And I learned from that experience that our numbers and how we report our numbers, we're only as effective as the story that we're trying to tell. And our numbers will only be as impactful as how those numbers support the story. And if we don't have the story, then the numbers are relatively meaningless. So, there are three things that numbers can help us do when we communicate business performance. Numbers can help us support a narrative of change. Numbers can help explain why this approach needs to be replaced by that approach, or why we need to make adjustments in the strategy. The numbers can help us demonstrate how what we're doing may not be working and why what isn't working needs to be replaced so something actually starts to work. And that's where the communication of messages of sales, of revenue, and showing what is and isn't working is pretty fundamental to what a business leader needs to be able to communicate. But it's a lot more than that. The numbers also can give us clues as to what is really happening in an organization. And so while the numbers can help support a narrative of change, the numbers can also give us the clues as to what should change. And this is where we have to dig deep into what the numbers tell us. And in class this week, we're going to dig deep into a whole bunch of different types of numbers to find the story and to find the clues of what the story should be. So one popular thing that businesses do is they do surveys of employee engagement. I won't launch into my cynicism about most surveys about employee engagement. I'll save that for later. But those surveys do yield a whole lot of data. And there's a whole lot of people who spend a whole lot of time figuring out what this whole lot of data is all about. And they may find a story now and then, but usually that story is pretty superficial. X number of people are really engaged in their jobs. Well, what does that really mean? Does that mean that they come to work? Does that mean that they work safely? Does that mean that they contribute? Does that mean that they're productive? What does that really mean? And what are the seeds of discontent within a spectrum of satisfaction? Because there are always going to be seeds of discontent. And unless you dig into what the numbers are telling you, you may be deceived by what you think the numbers are all about. So you have to look at numbers as like a great mystery, and what are the clues behind what looks obvious. And the third thing is that numbers can help confirm that what we're doing is actually working, and it's actually okay. And I realize it's kind of boring to walk into a session and say, hey, it's working, no big headline here. But the no surprise environment is one that almost anyone in business will welcome. And so using numbers to demonstrate, to reconfirm that what we're doing is on target is another good way to use numbers. But those numbers are only as effective as the story they support and the story they tell. And so you have to have the story. And every story, as you know from other conversations we've had, every story begins with what is the central message. Now, for the businesses that you all took a look at last week in class, you have a pretty good idea of what the central message may be for an Anheuser-Busch InBev or for a Whole Foods or for a Trader Joe's. Really dug into what that central message could be. Will that central message pass the test of the numbers? And once you look at the statistics of how the business performs, will that central message actually thrive? That central message of what the business is, what the business is trying to do, and how the business is doing is the frame for any communication of numbers that you may pursue. And so you have to begin with that central message. Then you look for the key ways that the numbers can support the story that the central message introduces. And that's where we do need to think creatively about how we use numbers. It's not as simple as just throwing up a bunch of charts and hoping that people get a conclusion from them. It's a matter of making a very clear point and then with clarity showing how the number supports the message. For example, numbers are very good at creating and establishing context. If you were, for example, an ABI InBev, very good example, because they're a fairly new operation, new combination of different companies, and so they do want to establish some kind of perspective of how they're doing in a competitive marketplace. And so it would make sense for the numbers to show this is what we do compared to this is what our competitors do. Same with a Southwest Airlines. As the airline industry continues to consolidate, how do we do compared to others? But what do we mean by how do we do? Airlines are notorious for finding all kinds of ways to report how they do. In fact, one of the great pieces of the Southwest legend is how when they didn't have real numbers to communicate in the 90s, they invented some of their own. I mean, these were actual numbers, but they put them together in such a way to create a new industry award called the Triple Crown. And the Triple Crown, certainly taking off what happens with horse racing, was intended to show that this is the pinnacle of airline performance. And the Triple Crown was simply the combination of three publicly available statistics: on-time performance, lost bags, and customer complaints. And not customer complaints directed to the airline, but customer complaints directed to the Department of Transportation, which means people have to really be upset about an airline if they're going to write the government. So every month or every quarter, Southwest would put together these publicly available statistics and declare themselves a winner of a contest that they themselves set up. And it was kind of funny one quarter when panic filled the halls at Southwest because they were about to lose the Triple Crown to somebody else, and until I reminded them that how could you lose a contest that you yourself sponsor? But the numbers do create a context in which the story of the company can be presented. The numbers also provide a lot of content and give a lot of material for us to help stakeholders understand and believe and take action from. And so if we're trying to look at rallying the forces because we're losing to the competition, certainly the use of numbers will help reinforce that message. The numbers also can provide a sense of continuity, that this is a commitment we have made over time, and as the numbers show, this is how we live up to that commitment. Again, the airline business is a great example when it comes to on-time performance. Now, the airlines, however, have become pretty savvy about on-time performance, and so they know that the way to potentially manipulate the on-time performance statistics is to make the travel time longer. And so all of a sudden you look at an airline schedule and it takes 4 hours to get what should be 2 hours away, and that's because they're padding the time so they can declare that they're on time, and things like that happen all the time. But it does provide a sense of continuity that we still hold important what we held important a long time ago. Things change in business, and numbers can also help us illustrate a challenge that a business may face. And that challenge certainly could come from a competitor. That challenge could come from what's happening in the industry. And that challenge can come from what happens inside. And that's where, again, this use of the statistics of engagement survey information can be really helpful if leadership is trying to tell a story of the importance of rallying the troops to support the business strategy. And that if we don't support the business strategy, the very things we're comfortable with could be threatened depending on what's happening in the industry. Now, numbers can help us clearly understand what's happening in a business. And that's where that favorite of all devices, the bar chart, is about as reliable as any particular device could be. It's easy to construct. More importantly, it's easy to absorb. It's very familiar. And it's a very good way to establish a comparison between one company and another, between one approach and another. And of the different approaches to bar charts, the horizontal bar chart is by far the easiest to read. There's something about reading vertical bar charts that can be a little bit odd, especially if the difference between the numbers is quite dramatic. Numbers can also help reinforce a message of consistency, that what we decided to do then and what we decide to do now still works. It's a comforting factor, if you will. And that's where the sloping graph or the line graph that shows the difference between things, and I'm not doing a very good job at this with my hands, but you've seen line graphs, and they show one line going this way and one line going that way, and they may show a difference between lines. But they do tend to show a consistency over time. Or if there's an inconsistency, can help in the story point out what needs to be addressed. Another approach to numbers that can help in this manner are the use of scatter dots. And you've seen these kind of grids and the different dots in different places to show where a company may fit according to various criteria. Now, one thing that when communicating numbers we need to be really careful about is clutter. And how do we get clutter off the slide, but more importantly, out of the brain? There is one approach to communicating numbers that I hope I never see again, and that is the pie chart. I think the pie chart is a really horrible thing, and I think pies are for eating, not for communicating numbers. And the reason is because, well, for me, the pie chart defines a finite world. And all of us know that the world of business doesn't really have traditional boundaries, and that any communication of numbers that suggests borders that we can count on is at best naive. I also think that pie charts are kind of cluttered. There's a lot to look at, and we always go to what looks like the biggest piece of the pie, but that may not be where the focus actually should be. When we put tables and grids and such things on slides or in handouts, it's really important to get rid of the lines that we don't need, or the borders that we don't need, or even the numbers that we don't need. If we're trying to show the relationship with things, we may not need to have every increment of number on the illustration, because it can simply add to the mess, and it can add to the junk, and it can get in the way of what we're trying to communicate with the numbers that we're presenting. Because when we're communicating with numbers, the center is of utmost importance. And by center, I mean where we want people to focus. We have to direct people when we're presenting numbers where to focus. We have to tell people what matters. The more numbers we may put on a slide, or the more numbers we may put in a story, makes it more important for us, challenges us to direct people where to pay attention. Otherwise, if we don't, people are going to be looking and finding the numbers they want and coming up with their own conclusions, and that could get in the way of the story that we're trying to tell. Because ultimately, any communication of numbers is a communication of change. Sometimes that communication of change is let's stay the same. But most of the time it means taking action. That there is something we need people to do as business leaders because of those numbers that we see on the screen, or those numbers that we see on the page, or those numbers that we hear a leader talking about. And so if we're going to reach that sense of resolution that we talked about in our discussion in class last week, then we have to consider, how do I use numbers to carefully support the message of change, so that when the change occurs and we can measure the impact of the change, we can experience the resolution that we seek. So it all comes back to how we tell the story. And so this week in class, as you look at different ways to use numbers and different stories that numbers can tell, it will be really important to remember this is the story that people need to understand, the message that people need to believe, and the actions that we need people to take, what we need them to do. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in class this week. Bye.